Kingdom as a plurinational union without an agreement on demos, telos, ethos, or sovereignty, far from being incompatible with the European Union, it is a very good fit, because that is exactly what the European Union is. And so that is really the fundamental basis of everything that I'm going to say, a way of understanding constitutionalism and political order that is alien to that Westminster, the old Dyson doctrine, but in fact perfectly compatible with some of the underlying assumptions in the devolution settlement and with membership of the European Union. And therefore, Brexit is profoundly destabilizing because it has taken away the external support system, not only for the devolution settlement, but also for the deeper and longer term understanding of the nature of the United Kingdom, and tried to substitute a unitary doctrine of unitary statehood and peoplehood and sovereignty that never really existed, and certainly has not existed since the end of the 20th century. What did the Europeans do? First of all, the EU introduced a discursive space for ideas about shared and divided sovereignty, which found an echo in the Good Friday Agreement. They found an echo in Scottish doctrines about the nature of sovereignty and the idea of the Union. They even provided a framework in which we could discuss Scottish independence, because it would not mean the end of all unions. It would just mean a reconstitution and reconfiguration of union in different ways. It provided an internal market, a system of supranational regulation that meant that the devolution settlement could be much more extensive, much more asymmetrical, and dispense with all kinds of framework laws, because they were provided by Europe. Very few people in London realized this, how much EU law applied directly in Scotland and didn't have to go through London, how much that Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland were able to exercise the same degree of discretion in the implementation of EU law and directives within their field of competences as a member state. And this enormously facilitated the way that devolution was operated in practice. And then the test of this was the vote. In the overall EU referendum vote in 2016, the EU voted by, the UK. Many people keep on mixing up UK and EU. I just kind of, when they're saying this, we all do it, but unconsciously. Anyway, the UK voted by 52% to leave, and as Theresa May famously said, the British people have decided on Brexit. The British people have spoken. This notion of the British people constantly evoked. When in Scotland, 62% voted Remain, in Northern Ireland, 56% voted Remain, divided, of course, on communitarian lines, and England and Wales both voted to leave. So if we're talking about a mandate, the question is, where does this mandate arise? Now, in Scotland, 62% voted to Remain. Interestingly enough, there was not a clear relationship between the vote for Scottish independence in Europe in 2014 and the vote on Europe in 2016. Indeed, about 30% of the people who had voted for independence subsequently voted to leave the EU. So they weren't following the consistent nationalist line, which is independence in Europe. But that has now changed. And so many people who had voted against independence in 2014 are now pro-independent. A smaller number of people have moved the other direction. So now there's an increasing coincidence between supporting independence, independence supporters are pro-Europe, and pro-European people are pro-independence. Between voting for the Nationalist Party, feeling totally Scottish, being pro-Europe and being pro-independence. So there's a polarization within Scotland, and something like 50% supporting independence in Europe. In Northern Ireland, you'll be all more familiar with this. On the Catholic nationalist side, a loss of support in the Good Friday Compromise, a return to support for Irish unification as having the plurality of support there, and again, a polarization within Northern Ireland as well as between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United England, a very interesting finding that support for Brexit correlated not with feeling British, but with feeling English. So it's a form of English nationalism which rejects not only the EU, but also the periphery if they are an obstacle. Interesting findings that most Brexit voters in England would support, would accept not only the secession of Northern Ireland, which is not surprising, but the secession of Scotland as well, if that were the price to pay for Brexit. And even in Wales, support for independence going up to 20 or 30%, which is unprecedented, almost entirely coming from pro-Remain voters. So there's a profoundly centrifugal effect here. The various parts of the United Kingdom are seeking their own place in relation to Europe, but it's very difficult to see what how a definitive resolution could be had for this, because if, as we know, if Ireland unifies, you get rid of one border, but you put another border in place. If Scotland becomes independent, we get rid of Scotland's border with the European Union, but you create a new border with England. So the problem is not where the borders are, the problem is borders themselves. The whole idea of borders with Brexit, which Brexit imposes, are the problem. And fundamentally, you'll be talking about Northern Ireland a great deal, but even in the case of Scotland, there's no easy outcome to all of this. At the same time, the UK government has, in its Brexit negotiations, it would be fair to say, almost completely ignored the position of the peripheral parts of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, except insofar as the Europeans have made them do something about Northern Ireland, which they're trying to undo themselves even as we speak. But otherwise, very little appreciation of the nature of the post-devolution UK state. On the contrary, there have been a series of centralizing measures, some of them just inadvertent, like the first version of the EU withdrawal bill, which says all of those powers that belong to Europe will take them back to Westminster, irrespective of whether they were devolved or not. That was pushed back after resistance at the periphery. The withdrawal agreement bill brought that back in again. But most recently, the UK internal market bill, which tries to create for the first time something called the UK internal market to replace the EU internal market that is gone, but does not have the key features of the EU internal market, which is the involvement of the member states in the making of law and the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. On the contrary, the UK unilaterally creates the conditions for an internal market. It is self-enforcing, and although it doesn't fundamentally, in theory, alter the balance of competences, it does simply undermine the exercise of competences in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Where does that leave us? If I had £10 for everybody who's asked me what happens next, and I was asked this question most recently an hour and a half ago, well, I could go look forward to a very prosperous retirement, but I haven't. This is an existential problem. Yes, there's 50% support for independence in Scotland, but that's not a majority. If Scotland became independent in the EU, the rest of the UK, outside the EU, you got a border between Scotland and England. The Northern Ireland question, again, is not where you put those borders, it's the nature of borders, it's the creation of hard borders themselves. And of course, this is all subsumed in the mystery, which is the UK's future relationship with the European Union and how far de facto the UK is going to mirror or accept European regulations. It is going to be a regulation taker, or how far it is going to insist on differentiating from the European Union in regulation. I suspect it'll be a bit of the two. So the constitutional settlement of 1999 has been fundamentally undermined right across the United Kingdom as a result of Brexit, and it's very difficult to see how we can put it together again. So I don't have any answers, I don't have any solutions, but I'm looking forward to the discussions about this, because I think the debate about the Northern Ireland Protocol will also shed a lot of light on the general question of the territorial constitution of the United Kingdom. where the other parts of the United Kingdom might end up. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Michael. And sort of raising questions I'm sure that will be returned to again today and tomorrow. I mean, one thing that strikes me that Brexit opened up an area of debate and raised questions that perhaps should have been asked before the referendum. But, you know, these are the things that occur. Okay, so as I said, we'll have our speakers first and then we can open up to the floor for questions. So thanks again, Michael. And our next speaker is Professor Katie Hayward, who is a Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University Belfast and a Senior Fellow of the UK in a Changing Europe think tank, where she leads a major ESRC funded project on the topic of the future and status of Northern Ireland after Brexit. She's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, an Eisenhower Fellow and a Fellow in the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute of Global Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University. And what Katie will be talking about today is Northern Ireland demographics and divisions.
Thank you very much, Derek, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to Federico for the invitation to take part on this panel. Before I begin, I want to apologise if there's unusual noise. I have somebody over my head on the roof fixing it, so hopefully he won't be too noisy. I came from my home to my office to avoid my noisy dogs, and unfortunately I've got someone on the roof, so apologies in advance if we get interrupted by that. I do have some PowerPoint slides to share because I have quite a few charts to share with you, as is my want as a social scientist. Hopefully this will work now. Seem to have frozen. Oh, okay, there we go. Great, okay. So yes, I'm working to the title of Northern Ireland Demographics and Division. And obviously the whole rationale, if you like, behind the protocol was in part the fact that Northern Ireland, the island of Ireland, has unique circumstances, and part of those unique circumstances relate to, if you like, the demographics and divisions within Northern Ireland. I want to begin by noting that, of course, any demographic alignment doesn't in and of itself determine the future for Northern Ireland, and it's important to note from the very beginning that, in fact, we constantly have an evolution of identities, of social identities and political identities, and even definitions of what political community means and its significance in response to a changing political context. So even the Good Friday Belfast Agreement itself marks significant changes in the definition of, say, Irish national identity. And so too, as Michael was picking up on there, perhaps at this very moment, we are seeing change in the definition of unionist identity as well. The question I'm wanting to ask in this is the degree to which there are new politically salient dividing lines in Northern Ireland that are arising as a result of this new context. And part of my working hypothesis there, putting it very simply indeed, is that opposition to Brexit, the roots of which I'll talk about, is in some ways translating into support for the protocol. And this has risks as well as benefits. Of course, the protocol is a very live issue at the moment. And the current handling of that protocol, and indeed the way in which the UK and EU will continue to be responsible for making very significant decisions with regard to the protocol, adds an element of unpredictability and a dynamism to this that is really quite significantly new, not least, of course, because we're now moving beyond the British-Irish relationship that was for so long the context for the future of Northern Ireland. Another element of complexity to all of this, which I know will be discussed more later on in this conference, is the point of the democratic consent vote mechanism, which has also complicated the degree to which there is political salience and particular division over the future of the protocol, i.e. the degree to which political identity is connected to the issues of the protocol as a source of identity. So the new context formed by Brexit and the protocol, I hope that's not too noisy for you, is it okay? Okay. Of course, so Strand 3 has been significantly changed by Brexit in of itself. The UK and Ireland are on different trajectories with the UK with the European Union now. And of course, Strand 2 has been significantly changed by the fact that Northern Ireland is no longer in the European Union, and the Irish border is more significant for many things, and will continue to increase in its significance, i.e. in the friction that is experienced with regards to crossing the Irish border as an external border of the EU. And I'm happy to talk about that more later. And I have, and this has a significant impact on North-South cooperation as well. The protocol endeavours, of course, to protect the Good Friday Agreement in all its dimensions, but as Michael was mentioning there towards the end, the context within which Northern Ireland's future and indeed the protection of the Good Friday Agreement is going to be decided has been radically transformed by the protocol. And this image here, normally I spell out the meaning of that over several slides. I'm just giving it to you there in a small diagram, but just to show the various dimensions that affect Northern Ireland's governance now. And of course, to really try and emphasize the fact that this is evolving. So if you're thinking about demographics, if you're thinking more particularly about political divisions, we see that political identities, political ambitions and aspirations, most particularly, if you like, as they relate to nationalism and unionism, are very much determined by this new, completely original context and highly, highly complex context. So the question is, what does this mean for the evolution of nationalism and unionism, if you like? And one thing I'm really wanting to emphasize in this is the position of neithers. So those neither unionist nor nationalist, which according to the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey are the plurality of people in Northern Ireland. What about those, most particularly, what about those who are pro-Remain? And I want to focus on them in particular in this, not least to try and complicate our understanding of what demographics and divisions look like in Northern Ireland itself. To put it in context, and I don't need to spell it out to this expert audience, but in terms of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, there are several things just worth bearing in mind here. The fact that the competing aspirations of nationalism and unionism are equally legitimate, and the consequence of that, of this framing of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, is that a disruption to the status quo of Northern Ireland's place in the UK or relationship with Great Britain is seen as a challenge for unionism. Another element of significance for the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is the idea of how it is being legitimised. Obviously, we have the consociational model at work to some degree in the institutions set up under Strand 1, i.e. that the people vote according to particular identity blocks. But the theme through here is that the legitimacy of it comes through direct representation. So we have representations from nationalism and unionism, and in that way, given the sort of compulsory, if you like, power sharing, that gives legitimacy to the decisions that are then made from the institutions. Another consequence of this has been the rise of Sinn Féin and the DUP, the more hardline expressions of nationalism and unionism since the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. And then we must, of course, remember too the context of multi-level governance, as I mentioned before. And what this means in this context, I think, is that cross-border cooperation has very real meaning. It has practical consequences. It is enabled by institutional cooperation to some degree, but is also symbolically important as well. So on to Brexit. So the Northern Ireland voted to remain by 56%, and I'm wanting now to look at the degree to which traditional political communities and divisions in Northern Ireland were replicated and reinforced or otherwise through Brexit and the protocol. So this is the vote from the referendum by Westminster constituencies, and we can see from the Westminster election results in 2017, red being DUP, green being Sinn Féin, and the independent Sylvia Herman there in North Down. So with the exception of East Londonderry, which has Gregory Campbell as its MP. We can see the clear pattern there, putting it in very stark terms. Interestingly enough, Gregory Campbell's vote is around 40%, and the vote to remain in the EU in East Londonderry was 60%. John Gary's excellent work on breaking down and analysing the referendum results in Northern Ireland showed very clearly that there was a unionist nationalist difference in this. So even though the UUP campaigned to stay in the European Union, the majority of its supporters voted to leave. Very clear support for remaining in the EU from nationalist parties, and then the Alliance Party, very strong showing for remaining in the EU. And then just to jump straight ahead, the question of the impact that Brexit has had on the grounds for political identities and aspirations in Northern Ireland. So this is looking at the results in the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey over the period since just after the Brexit referendum, 2016 to 2020. So we've been asking them in NILT 2 questions. So do you think Brexit makes United Ireland more likely? And then does Brexit make you more in favour of United Ireland? So just things to draw to your attention here. If we look at nationalists, they've increasingly thought that Brexit makes United Ireland more likely, very significantly so. For those who are neither unionist nor nationalist, the big change came in 2020, where we've seen a huge rise in those thinking that Brexit makes United Ireland more likely. I should say that NILT survey work is done in the autumn. So this was post the withdrawal agreement. And similarly too amongst unionists now, a plurality of unionists think that Brexit makes United Ireland more likely. And again, the change then was into 2020. So this is really important to understand if we're trying to appreciate the reasons why unionists are reacting the way that they are, to some degree, to the protocol. And then in terms of support for United Ireland, unsurprisingly, unionists are not more supportive of a United Ireland as a result of Brexit. In fact, there's a rise in those who are less in favour of it. And then in terms of those who are neither unionist nor nationalist, you can see here a huge rise in those who are saying they're more in favour of United Ireland when neither unionist nor nationalist. This is really significant. And you can see, possibly as could have been predicted, a very significant rise amongst nationalists of those saying they're more in favour of Irish unity. I wanted to look at this in a slightly different way and look by religion, which I'm normally very, for good reason, very cautious about doing, but again, it's a different take on the same question. So comparing 2016 to 2020 results in terms of constitutional preference, looking at Catholic respondents, we see a significant rise by 15 points of those who are saying that the preferred long-term future for Northern Ireland that they would hold is United Ireland. So now we have clear 50% saying that amongst the Catholic population. There could be many reasons for this, not just Brexit. Part of the decrease in support for devolution within the UK, sorry about the noise, is obviously the fact, or no doubt the fact, that for a good long period during Brexit withdrawal negotiations, we didn't have a sitting executive and assembly. No big change amongst Protestants, but again, those of no religion, so about 2/3 of those of no religion would just identify as neither unionist nor nationalist, and 25% as unionist. But you can see here quite how significant a rise there has been there amongst support for Irish unification. And one thing people often point to, and Neil O'Doherty's written an excellent article on this particular theme, is around election results change since Brexit. And obviously most striking there is the rise in support for other parties, so mainly Alliance and the non-aligned Alliance, and that's really at the expense of unionists' vote. So I just wanted to conclude by sharing some analysis of the Lucid Talk poll that has been done for us in Queen's for our post-Brexit governance project led by Professor David Finnemore. And I'm going to share results with you that we haven't publicised, but this looking in particular at community identity and the degree to which there are differences between community groups in Northern Ireland vis-a-vis the protocol. Because this is highly pertinent, of course, to the question of divisions as being rewritten post-Brexit and post-protocol. Please, I don't expect you to take all of this in, but just basic headline figures in terms of people who are thinking, this is overall of our poll, strongly negative impacts or negative impacts, where those are falling as a result of the protocol. We see they are predominantly in relation to UK-EU relations and British-Irish relations. Also, Northern Ireland's constitutional place in the UK, and also most particularly on political stability in Northern Ireland. What we have seen in the last poll compared to the previous two, which were in spring and summer, is a rise in the belief that the protocol is having a positive impact on the economy and on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And this is where we begin to get to the root of the current difficulties, if you like, and so the question of whether the protocol is on balance a good thing, we can see very big differences between nationalists, neithers, and unionists on that question. We see quite how distinct the strong unionists are on that particular point. Strong unionists obviously being TUV and DUP in the main. And we see there are more nuanced views or varied views amongst slightly unionists or softer unionists. Minister Coveney mentioned there is majority support for the protocol according to the polls. So this poll is one of those. That tip towards having a majority has come very much from nationalists and indeed neithers being more strongly in favour of the protocol than they were up to the summer. And then if we look here in terms of the impact of the protocol on the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, we see that it's seen as very positive by nationalists, negative by unionists, and those who are neither unionists or nationalists, on balance, they are thinking that it's positive. And then this is another indication of the significance of political identities and the protocol, in that when we ask them how they'd like the MLAs to vote on the protocol in 2024, so that's the consent vote, the first one anyway, we can see quite how different the views are there between unionists and nationalists. Neithers on balance being 2/3 of them wanting full application of the protocol. And you can see there very strong opposition from unionists and a clear opposition from those who are slightly unionist. And just one last thing on this. We did ask several questions. One would be to the degree to which people would agree or disagree on certain statements. One statement was the UK government would be justified if it were to trigger Article 16 now. The average came out at 53% saying it would not be. And you can see then those who are neither very much more in line with those who are nationalists than those who are unionist. So a large portion there mirroring the Leavers and Remainers divide, and that's continuing on through in views with regards to the protocol. So looking ahead, as I say, we're talking about an evolving situation here, and we need to recognise that identities evolve as well, and of particular interest is the question of how pro-Remain neithers or non-aligned will evolve post-Brexit, post-protocol. I've heard Lord Frost say a couple of times recently, and others in the UK government, that if they manage to sort the technical problems around the protocol, then they believe that political consensus and agreement in Northern Ireland and support for the protocol will follow. And I'm not sure necessarily whether this is true. If you're looking at this particular, this kind of data, I think a particular question is the space for a growth of soft unionist support for the protocol. You see there are varied opinions around that. key here will be political leadership from the softer unionists, and to whether there's enough given to them in any redrawing of the protocol that will enable them to support it. In the medium term, we have these assembly elections by next May. Already you can understand, looking at those polling results, why it is that the DUP think that are very clear that being opposed to the protocol is a strong foundation for any election campaign. And the consent vote will be viewed by many as being more or less equivalent to a border poll. And this is a question more generally as to whether those constitutional matters can be separated from discussion around the protocol, and hence the importance of the neithers here. And then in the longer term, perhaps a pertinent question is whether it's possible at all to create the conditions in which cross-community legitimacy of the protocol can grow, bearing in mind the complexity of the situation and the fact that both nationalism and unionism think that this is a critical moment for their future. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, for that talk. Lots of facts and figures that tell a story, I think, a snapshot of the present moment and the kind of divisions around the issue of Brexit on a number of different levels. And I'm sure we're going to return to that when we come into the questions. And the noise in the background, they weren't building a border post or anything like that right on your roof. Okay, so thank you for that, Katie. And our next speaker is Professor Oran Doyle, who's a professor in law at Trinity College Dublin, where he was head of school from 2014 to 2018. He holds an LLB and a PhD from Trinity College Dublin and an LLM from Harvard University. He's held visiting positions at the Academia Sinica Te Pai, Bocconi University in Milan, and Keio University, Tokyo. And he's currently a visiting faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. And some of his recent publications, The Brexit Challenge for Ireland and the United Kingdom, Constitutions Under Pressure from Cambridge University Press, and dealing specifically with the issue of Brexit. And so Professor Doyle today will deal with Ireland, developments and debates.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Federico, for the invitation. Thanks, Derek, for the introduction. So, yeah, my paper is titled Ireland, Developments and Debates. And what it tries to get at, or the issues that it tries to explore, are issues arising for Ireland from the UK's exit from the European Union that to a certain extent are understandably overshadowed at the moment because of all of the important and pressing issues around the protocol. So the four questions that I want to look at over the next 15 minutes or so is, first of all, what sort of member state is Ireland post-Brexit? Then I want to ask the question, for reasons I'll explain, about how might Irish unification occur. Then I'm going to explore the sorts of issues that unification, should it happen, or should it even be on the table, would raise for Ireland and the EU. And finally, sort of to loop back around and ask, if unification did happen, what sort of member state might Ireland be in the European Union? I have to enter two important caveats. Okay, so nothing that I say should be taken as advocating for United Ireland, and I'm not making any assessment about how likely that is to happen. It's just more on the political agenda than it used to be, and is sufficiently plausible in my view to be worth discussing, but I'm not taking any position on it. Much of what I say draws on the following two works. So this is a sort of acknowledgement masquerading as an advertisement, or vice versa. So much of the analysis will draw on the Working Group on Unification Referendums on the Island of Ireland, which Professor Hayward was also co-author, as was Professor O'Neill, or Professor O'Leary, I beg your pardon. He'll be speaking tomorrow. And then the other is the slightly blurred cover of the book that you just mentioned, The Brexit Challenge for Ireland and the United Kingdom, and some chapters in there that try to draw out some of these issues. To take the first question then, so what sort of member state is Ireland post-Brexit? And I thought that a useful way of exploring that might be around sort of the big questions in political debate, or what might be the big questions, the political cleavages. For much of the history of the state, the national question dominated. It was, in a way, provided the continuing dividing line between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil based on their origins, but probably also the robustness of their position in relation to Northern Ireland and the possibility of national unification. With the 1998 agreement, probably prior to that, but certainly with the 1998 agreement, you approach a point really of at least establishment consensus, but I think more than establishment consensus on that. That ceases to be an issue around which Irish politics revolves. It's fair to say that Sinn Féin's position on that is perhaps somewhat ambiguous in that they are supporters of the Good Friday Agreement and the constitutional settlement involved therein. They're committed to national unification in the same way, well, most other Irish political parties are committed to unification, but Sinn Féin it's much more of a priority for Sinn Féin. And so it's possible that with the growth and support for Sinn Féin, that issues around unification might again become a dividing ground in Irish politics. That doesn't seem particularly likely at present. The second characteristic of Ireland as a member state is attitudes to the EU, which have pretty much always been very positive. Membership was approved by large majority in 1972. Subsequent treaties have been ratified as referendum. There were blips with the Nice referendum in 2001, the Lisbon referendum in 2008, but that was probably due to a mixture of political complacency and Celtic Tiger era complacency. Both were then approved at subsequent referendums by large enough majorities and larger turnouts. And the Fiscal Compact Treaty was approved first time round in 2012. And you see during Brexit really support for the EU and Irish membership going up into almost despotic territory up into the 90s. So it remains very strongly pro-European country. A cleavage which has sort of underlain much of Irish politics, and I think probably had a disproportionate impact on how Ireland might have been viewed from afar, is one between, roughly speaking, religious conservatives and liberal secularists. And that was a story of gradual, intermittent, not entirely linear change from the 1970s onwards, but really culminating or coming to the last major steps on that journey with the referendums in 2015, approving marriage equality, and 2018, authorising the legislature significantly to liberalise the grounds on which abortions are available, followed up by less important referendums, further easing the rules on divorce, removing blasphemy from the constitution. If that was a debate, I think politically the liberal secularists have won that one. That's no longer, there's a couple of residual issues left over from it, but it's no longer an animating ground of debate in Irish politics. What we do see perhaps starting to emerge is more of a left-right debate. Political debate much more focuses on issues of the health service, housing, appropriate levels of taxation to pay for those, etc. The dog that hasn't barked is anti-immigrant populism, occasional flickers of that, but it hasn't become expressed in the party political system in any meaningful way. Some people advance almost political structure arguments for that the PRSTV voting system provides an outlet for the sort of grievances that might otherwise be harnessed by anti-immigrant populist parties. I wonder whether Sinn Féin, as an anti-establishment party with a national agenda that might be attractive to people who would otherwise be attractive to anti-immigrant populism, is perhaps blocking a share of the political market there, whereas of course Sinn Féin is very much in favour of immigration, so it doesn't fit those characteristics. Anyway, so that's sort of a sense of where Ireland is, and perhaps makes it, I'm not a political scientist by any means, but perhaps makes Ireland look a little bit more like a normal EU member state, or perhaps a normal EU member state circa 2000, 2005, than it had done in the past. Brexit causes particular challenges, and wholly apart from issues over Northern Ireland and the protocol, And I think has prompted concerns or renewed focus on alliance and influence building. So there's a concern that Ireland in the EU without the UK will lack a country of which they're with like mind on many issues. So as a lawyer, I know the courts or Chief Justice and so on are very concerned that we are now the only solely common law country in the European Union. That places a whole lot of extra responsibility on our own civil service to be able to engage efficiently around the drafting of laws, cases before the European Court of Justice. And what you see, I think, is political issues trying to develop alliances with other EU member states. I'm thinking about those alliances more strategically, perhaps, than we had to do in the past. A real push to develop the pool of candidates, Irish candidates who would be eligible to serve in the European institutions, a feeling that we've allowed ourselves to become underrepresented there. So government policy from the Department of Foreign Affairs tries to address that. And also an attempt to refocus on alliance and influence building across Great Britain outside of the Dublin-London state-to-state relationship, with the opening and further strengthening of consulates, specific arrangements with Wales recently. So that is sort of, Ireland's position as an EU member state on the issues that are of concern to us, perhaps prompted by Brexit. I then want to go on now and look at how unification might happen. So it turns on the Good Friday Agreement and requires the consent freely and concurrently given North and South to bring about a united Ireland. So how does that work out in practice? This is seriously abbreviated, but the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has discretion to call a border poll to see whether there is consent in Northern Ireland for unification. Okay. However, the Secretary of State is under an obligation, if it appears likely to them that a majority would vote in favour of unification. A lot of ink has been spilled on trying to work out how the Secretary of State might assess whether such a majority exists. There is, I think what the conclusion we come to in the report is that there's no one conclusive form of evidence. All forms of evidence could and should be considered, including opinion poll evidence, representation in the Assembly, representation of the Northern Ireland constituencies at Westminster, and so on. All of those should inform the Secretary of State's view. The referendums, there must be a referendum in the South as well, for reasons I would be prepared to explain if we had a lot longer. Those referendums must be concurrent. Don't think this means simultaneous, but it does mean that they have to be more or less at the same time and on the same set of issues. That has an important implication that it's not possible for Northern Ireland to vote first, then to carry out some negotiations, and then have the South to vote on something which would effectively be different. Okay, so they must be voting on effectively the same question. If both North and South vote in favour, the referendums mandate unification. Unification must occur under the terms of the agreement, but legislation is required in Dublin and London to give effect to it. Now, the agreement was clearly written under the expectation that relations between Dublin and London would be good, and if unification referendums were passed, Dublin and London would work together in good faith to give effect to those votes and present complementary legislation to their respective parliaments, and unification would go ahead smoothly. I'm not so sure that those assumptions still hold. There is in all of this a sort of runaway train scenario in which it is possible that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland might be legally directed by a court to call a poll. Unlikely, but possible. If that happened, the poll would have to go ahead in the North. If the North voted in favour, there would have to be a vote in the South, and then there would have to be legislation to give effect to those two votes. But nobody would have been able to do any planning, or at least they wouldn't have been able to negotiate any details prior to the votes taking place. And so this leaves a real risk that people find themselves in a situation where unification has to go ahead, but there's no agreement on the terms on the terms of unification, which is reminiscent of Brexit in many ways. So this tends, in my view, there are other opposing views on this, to suggest that a detailed plan before the referendums, insofar as possible, would be desirable, rather than waiting until after the referendums, the sort of Brexit model of vote first and ask questions later, not being such a good idea in my view. What are the sorts of issues that would have to be considered in that context? There's ones for the Irish state, primarily constitutional issues. There's lots of issues. Constitutional issues are really around, would devolution for Northern Ireland continue or not? So would it be a fully unitary state or a unitary state with a devolved Northern Ireland? And there's also issues about Irish identity in the constitution and the extent to which they should be amended to make it more welcoming for those of a formerly unionist disposition. But the ones I want to focus on a little bit more today are, what might the issues be for the European Union? Because the European Union has a stake in this, the European Council having decided in April 2017 that if Irish unification were to occur, Northern Ireland would become part of the EU in a sort of East German accession style or East German absorption style, rather than an accession process. So this means any votes in favour have consequences for the European Union. Some of them around EU citizenship. Would the EU be prepared to grant EU citizenship to British citizens in Northern Ireland who are exercising their right not to be Irish citizens? At the moment, there's probably very little divergence between Ireland and Northern Ireland, but the longer the UK stays out of the EU, the more that is going to grow. So what plans would the EU have for Northern Ireland catching up again with the acquis communautaire? There'd be a sea border between Ireland and Great Britain to negotiate. That's probably going to have implications for fishing, fishing rights. What's the EU's position going to be on that? And also there's a question about how the protocol itself comes to an end. Okay, there's some ways for that, but it probably requires the agreement of the UK. So all of these are questions that the EU will have to address, and which I think the EU institutions can't wait until after the votes. Having made this commitment that the effect of the votes would be the EU membership, they're probably not going to be able to say we're not going to give any answers to the questions until after people have voted. So European institutions, other member states need to start thinking about this at some level. That's so speculative, I will leave that for now because I'm nearly out of time. But maybe just to draw some lessons from the overall Brexit process to these discussions around unification, point to perhaps the importance of planning, a point that Derek touched on earlier. How do you design the referendum process? Plans before the votes, plans after. The difficulty of negotiations to implement a broad and unspecified political mandate when that's happening in the context of distrust between the parties. And finally, seems to me from an outside perspective that the electoral interests of the UK Conservative Party are a significant driver of constitutional change within the United Kingdom. And it's quite possible that Irish unification were to happen might play out in that context as well, of a Labour Secretary of State agreeing or deciding that a border poll should be held, and a Conservative Party perhaps campaigning for re-election on the grounds that a border poll shouldn't have been held and committed to not implementing the result of the poll. So I think has the potential to play out in very messy circumstances, and it's probably better to be thinking about those sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Oren, for that. Again, in terms of the local issues, very much in the relevancy and the idea of beginning that kind of discussion, I think is important. So look, we've had our three panelists, and we've touched upon Northern Ireland, and the UK from a sociological view, from a legal view, constitutional view, and from a political view. I have a few questions already in the chat box, and I'll sort of begin with them. But then if anybody has any kind of questions or queries, to sort of put your hand up in terms of the Zoom function, or to put them in the chat box. But just one question here from Shauna. How or is the UK government dealing with the conflict of supposedly speaking to the other EU other international countries on behalf of the UK and its regions versus speaking for English interests. I suppose that tension between speaking outwards towards Europe and the world, but then also speaking to the regions within the UK. Perhaps that's one for Michael, but anybody can sort of come in on that.
Should I come in on that then?
Yeah.
Yeah, the answer is that they're not taking account of the views of the devolved. And the normal formula is to say in advance, we will consult, which is not the same as engagement. It's not the same as the consent principle that has never been really invoked, although it is now being put into little bits of the internal markets bill, but in a very vague way. Or to say we'll consult the devolved before we go into negotiations, but it's always too late. It's at the wrong stage of the process. And whereas the devolved were part of the British negotiating team within the European Union for day-to-day policy for many years, even before devolution with the offices, that is not happening. That did not happen with the Brexit negotiations. It did not happen with the negotiations over the TCA, and it is not happening with the working out of future arrangements. Of course, there's the Northern Ireland potential veto over the protocol in some time in the future, but that is the only instance in which the devolves have any decisive influence. And then, of course, the future negotiations of trade deals with third countries is being done, again, without reference to either the political interests or the economic interests of the devolved. That's another respect in which the UK is reconstituting itself as a unitary state as a result of Brexit.
Okay, thank you, Michael. It's a very straightforward answer. Another question, I think this might be for Katie, or did you want to come in there, Katie?
Yes, very briefly, just it's a good question, and it just reminds me of the fact, of course, that the British government and the Irish government are both talking for Northern Ireland internationally, but saying very different things, and they've been doing that since the referendum, and of course that has significant ramifications for here, and indeed, and how different communities here view external actors, including the EU, and of course including America as well.
Okay, I think this question is for you, Katie, that from Colin. You know, that the economic, I suppose, issues around the protocol, did they trump the traditional religious sort of cultural positions in terms of those kind of figures that you're talking about? I mean, which is more important now, do you think?
Well, so the University of Liverpool survey a couple of weeks ago was suggesting that the protocol is down the list of priorities when people think about what concerns them. Obviously, the crisis in the health sector, etc., is more important. I say obviously, but that's coming forward. That said, when we asking people, will the protocol and your support for it or otherwise, or thinking about the consent vote, will that determine your choice of candidate, how you vote in 2022? Only 20% of people say no, it won't. And this is the challenge in Northern Ireland in the post-agreement political landscape, right? That it is what's seen as being what becomes the major motivation for people's choice of candidate, where they cast their votes, and indeed how the order of preference that they give different parties. That's a different calculation, oftentimes, to the one in which they're looking at manifesto commitments, whatever that's worth, and everything else. And so this is the challenge now, that in no insignificant way the consent vote has meant that the protocol actually is going to be a big issue in voting. And then in terms of the economic impacts of the protocol, so in other work I've done in the border region, people, when you ask about the impact that the protocol and Brexit are having, they talk about economic effects, but their concerns are for political stability and the ramifications for identity and relations between communities. So that far and above all else, it's a political stability question that is of most concern to people, even if it's the economic impacts that are perhaps more directly felt.
Question here from Katie, and this could be for anyone, I suppose, but how well understood by the public is the protocol, if you know what I mean? So the idea that they're for and against the protocol, but do the public have a solid understanding of its impacts, of what it is?
So I'll go first and listen to other people. So so in our panel poll that we use for Lucid Talk, 75% of people say they have a good understanding of the protocol, but about 45% say that reliable information is available on it. So this is what you get in this that kind of polling. I think people have a sense that they understand it and its ramifications, but in fact the information around it is not readily available. And if you begin to talk to people about it, it's quite clear that there is a lot of misunderstanding and misperception. And we tested this in our most recent testing the temperature poll there, in that we asked specific questions just to see the degree to which people understood. And it was around grace periods. One question was around Article 16 and what it would mean. And 43% of people thought it just meant temporary and specific measures to suspend part of the protocol, and 43% thought it meant a wholesale suspension of the protocol, which is wrong. So there's a lot of misunderstanding, and it's not surprising given that there's a lot of debate around the ramifications of the protocol, and this is all the way through to things like ECJ, where when you begin to ask people about it, for example, some people I've been meeting with who are concerned around it, they're worried about being pulled up before a foreign court. So this is what will then translate into how people, whether they go on a protest or how they might cast their vote. So this misinformation and misunderstanding is of really serious concern.
Yeah. Any other comments from Oren or Michael around that sort of understanding of?
There's quite a little bit of polling around the time of the so-called backstop and the negotiations, and when people were asked about specific things about inspections of cattle at the port of Larne and things, well, they said that's all right, it wasn't a problem. But predictably, once it was politicized and became salient, it then became a proxy, I think, for a whole lot of other things and tapped into existing polarization. And that's really not surprising, because people can't be expected to understand. If we have difficulty explaining this, and how are the people in the street to explain it? But it seems to come, and I think it's consistent with what Katie's saying, it seems to have become something that itself is polarizing, because of what it seems to symbolize is shorthand for a lot of other things that are deeply rooted in the identity politics of Northern Ireland.
I see that Bertie Ahern is in the audience, and just it struck me that if there's confusion around the protocol, perhaps there's confusion around the Good Friday Agreement itself, that Bertie Ahern was central in terms of getting over the line and bringing into being. Any comments on that, like in terms of the way it's become a kind of football, I suppose, in the debate in the present moment?
You're letting me in, are you?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Thank you very much. But first of all, can I just thank the speakers? It's really interesting. I think, listen, Martin McGuinness always used to say that the most read document ever in Northern Ireland was the Good Friday Agreement, because the people literally in the hills and the ditches, as well as the cities and towns, actually read the document and questioned the document, particularly his colleagues. So I suppose it's been well and truly debated ever since. There was some ambiguity around some things, not as much as I think people sometimes say. People say that we designed a lot of it to create ambiguity and make it seem that's not true. It might have turned out that way. With the exception of decommissioning, I think decommission was the one where we were trying to find a way through, and not very clearly, and that's why it took us 9 years to deal with it. But just listening to the speaker, just make 2 points. One, I think on the list of items that have to be dealt with before a referendum, I think the idea of having a referendum, as some people articulate, and some people, and there's been some university work in the UK on this, saying that we should have the referendum first. I think that's insanity. A referendum before the detail is worked out will mean it will be rejected both north and south. In my view, there's no doubt about that. People are far too politically wise. They're used to referendums, particularly in the south. They want to see the detail. And it's not the detail about costs. It's not about budget, which is sometimes said. It's just the detail. So that's one point. The other point is the difficulty with the protocol and whether it's understood or misunderstood. I spend a lot of my life still in the north. The reality is in East Belfast and in the ghettos and in the areas where you're likely to get trouble, the people haven't got a clue about the protocol, not a clue. And they see it as identity. They see it as a road to the Dublin government taking over again, and this is a pathway to that. And that's the hard reality. And I've sat in on 2 very sizable meetings in the month of October, and it was just quite clear. The idea of it's about trade or it's about all the things that we know it's about just passes them by. In fact, they're not interested. It's seen as a trick by the South to move the border from across the island and to put it down the Irish Sea as a trap for Dublin. That's how they see it. And even those who you might consider to be a bit more intelligent and articulate. So that is the difficulty. So we're trying to do 2 things. We're trying to solve the difficulties of medicine and meats and everything else in the protocol. But there's another issue of the protocol, which is what's in the head and the ideological one, and that's a far more difficult one to do. And Jeffrey Donaldson well understands how we might get over the detail, and the reason he keeps on about the other issue is because he's trying to, which I don't blame him for, he's trying to serve the loyalist community as well. So I just make those few points.
Thank you for that. Another sort of question here from Tom Flynn, that increasingly, and this is for you, Katie, increasingly people are sort of expressing themselves as exclusively Northern Irish, as opposed to Irish or British, or some combination of both. And is there any kind of polling or data on that sort of sense of connection or community, and how it might sort of react to border polls or indeed the protocol and so on?
Yes, there's been a lot of work on that from people like Kevin McNichols, and John Tong has written on that, and others, really fascinating work. So it's not really a political identity per se. It's most popular amongst younger Protestants who are less likely to use the term British to describe their identity. And this is in contrast to younger Catholics who are more likely to talk about themselves as Irish. So yeah, that's a growing area of interest, but I think possibly more significant is what's happened to British and Irish post-Brexit, and the fact that we now have fundamental and real inequality between British and Irish citizens, or citizenships, perhaps I should say, as is experienced now when British citizens travel to the EU. And I think that's going to become more apparent over time. So that's sort of that's a real jolt, I think, to some of the assumptions behind the foundations for the agreement itself. And one thing, just to pick up on what Betty Hearn was saying, it is worth bearing in mind that quite a lot of the anti-protocol protests and provocation, if you like, comes from people who never accepted the Good Friday Belfast Agreement to begin with, and who do see this as an opportunity to, the protocol context as an opportunity to push and push and push on that one and the compromises or accommodation that was made in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. I'm talking about certain quarters of loyalism, just as we had the same for certain quarters of republicanism who didn't accept the Good Friday Belfast Agreement and who saw Brexit as a means to push as well to get what their ultimate ambition. So for all our concern for the Good Friday Agreement, it's important to bear that in mind, that there are sections who still don't accept it, and this is one reason why this is such a disruptive force, if you like, Brexit and the protocol, because there's that element in reactions to it.
One question here. How serious is the UK government about effective intergovernmental relations? I mean, how serious are they about, I suppose, those connections within the UK, but also then on a broader scale? Any comments, Michael?
Yes, they talk about it a lot, but it's never really been a priority. It's never been institutionalized since devolution. Responsibility keeps on shifting. It's the Ministry of Justice, it's Cabinet Office, it's Michael Gove, it's somewhere or other. Because in Whitehall, this is not a discrete thing. This is you may have to deal with the Scots on agriculture and the Irish on fisheries or whatever. There's no one place because there's no federal understanding of the United Kingdom, whatever, in Whitehall. So this is a series of bilateral relationships governed by the principle of hierarchy, frankly. And every now and then there will be a review. There was one a couple of years ago by Andrew Dunlop. There's just been another one recently. There's another one ongoing. And we say the same thing to them, that you must have a degree of formalization of this, and you must get rid of the idea that ultimately the UK government always has the last word, because although it may often not always exercise its power in that overt hierarchical way, the fact that they can has a feedback effect on the entire negotiation process and all the way down to official level, because you know that eventually the UK is going to get its way. People talk about federalism. People talk about federalism in the United Kingdom when they run out of anything else to say, because they don't know what federalism is. My colleague Alvin Jackson, who's well known in Northern Ireland, of course, calls it the wonder drug of constitutional debate. But there's that lack of understanding that this is a devolved polity. And every few years I'm brought down to talk about it. The last one, I went down there and they gave me a huge lanyard saying, devolution matters, and a mug saying, devolution and you. They said, you can take the mug home with you. I said, no, I'm going to leave it here because you're the people who need to understand this. And back in 1976, when we were going to have a Scottish Assembly and a Welsh Assembly, I taught a course in the Civil Service College on devolution, because all the incoming civil servants had to learn about devolution, whether they wanted to or not. That didn't happen in 1999. And it only happened sporadically since that. Maybe that's inevitable in such an asymmetrical system. That's going to happen. But there's something fundamentally wrong. And when Whitehall wakes up to this, it's always a bit too late. They constantly run into crisis. Things like the first withdrawal bill, I was just amazed that nobody had thought that it was a problem that you take back all the devolved powers. It was just convenient. The internal market bill, similarly, I was just amazed that they hadn't learned from the previous episodes since the 2016 referendum, but they hadn't. So that learning is just not there. So when there's a crisis, something is done, but on a day-to-day basis, there's not very much going on by way of intergovernmental relations.
I mean, this is something that is to bring Oren in, I suppose, from an Irish perspective as well. But is Brexit and the reactions within the UK just been utterly reactive since 2016? You know, that it's just reacting to each kind of crisis or issue as it arises, or is there a plan? And I suppose this is where Oren comes in terms of a kind of an internal discussion here within Ireland in terms of reunification, that we need to have a plan, or at least begin to sort of think of having a plan, or put some shape on how we might approach these kind of issues?
Yeah, so I suppose answer the first bit, looking from the outside in terms, it seems the UK government is just Brexit focused almost to the exclusion of all else, and a particularly ever purifying type of Brexit for whatever reason that is. And that probably makes a meaningful commitment to intergovernment relations between Britain and Ireland difficult. Then in terms of, from the Irish perspective, the need for planning, and to pick up on what Bertie Ahern said, I agree with the need for planning, absolutely. But I think the two things, there's two slight problems with it. The first is I think the UK wouldn't engage in planning or negotiations before any vote in Northern Ireland in favour of unification. I think that would be seen in the UK, and possibly rightly so, as sort of selling out the constitutional position in advance. And second, unionists in Northern Ireland have every reasonable, legitimate political incentive not to engage in any discussions or planning, in my view, before United Ireland actually happens, until legislation is passed in Westminster and the deed is done, if that ever comes to place. So you're left in a situation, I think, that the planning that has to be done has to be primarily led by the Irish government. And insofar as it's completely in control, and that would be specifying constitutional changes that might take place in the event of unification, the Irish government should, in a consultative way, but ultimately it's up to the Irish government to put those forward to the people. The Irish government is, in a sense, making a dual offer, or an offer to two electorates, north and south. It has an incentive to make that offer as attractive as possible to both of them, and has to go a long way down the road. I think you're right in terms of working out the detail of that offer insofar as it can, given the legitimate reluctance of the British government to be involved prior to a vote, and also the legitimate reluctance of Northern Unions to be involved at that point.
Thank you. I have a question here from Michael Quinn. No, from Shauna actually, and then Michael Quinn. The UK government being prepared to break international law, and how has that impacted on Irish or wider EU views on the UK's standing, or does it have any impact? Any comments? Or everybody just going to stay silent on that? Oren, you're a lawyer.
Yeah, you sort of wonder whether it certainly has an impact in Ireland, and it certainly has an impact in the discussion about unification. That it got to the point where you could no longer, I'm not saying that this would happen, but you could no longer be sure that the UK Parliament would respect votes to unify. They've established that they're willing to break international law in certain circumstances, and I would see this one as going potentially close enough to core issues of national identity that they might decide to break international law and not respect the votes. So I think it's a factor there to the extent you're thinking about unification. Otherwise, I sort of had half a suspicion that other countries in the world would be prepared to factor it out. Say, yes, like the UK, you wouldn't trust them around issues of Brexit, for example, but that's not going to spill over into their other international agreements. But I suspect it doesn't play well in the United States, given the concern of the current president in particular for Northern Ireland. So it has some spillover effect, but I don't think it's necessarily going to contaminate the way all countries around the world view the UK.
Katie?
I mean, to be fair, Oren, they were only going to break international law in a limited and specific way. No, I'm messing. So it's a very live concern, and there are also concerns around what the plans might be with respect to Article 16 and how that would be managed domestically if it were to be invoked by the UK. And although the tone at the moment is more positive, I don't think, of course, that threat has gone away. And Lord Frost was mentioning just yesterday on Good Morning Ulster, in fact, he started his contribution by mentioning Article 16. And the reason why there are concerns around that and around plans that the UK government might have in relation to that, connect to obviously basically the potential ramifications for overriding the withdrawal agreement and particularly its application in domestic law as it relates to Northern Ireland. And there are two key points here. One is concerns that then arise with respect to other protections that are and other commitments made in the protocol, most particularly with regards to individual rights, equality and safeguards, so Article 2, the status of that. I know those are real concerns. And then secondly, more broadly, is the question of the general point about rule of law. And if it's the case that the UK government equips itself or attempts to equip itself to break international law, the standing, therefore, of the rule of law, even all the way down to how the Good Friday Agreement is then seen, and the commitments that are made there, and including in the Northern Ireland Act, and also just more broadly, the fact that the peace process depends on that, and on people being able to say, no matter what your point of view, no matter how intense your frustrations or concerns, that there are democratic means of expressing them, and that the rule of law and indeed upholding the police service, etc., all of these things should be maintained. And so what is interesting is probably not well appreciated is a connection between on the street level management of division all the way up to that very highest level of what might even be said on the floor of the House of Commons.
Okay, thank you, Katie. This is another kind of question from Michael Quinn, but it goes back to the other question, you know, the priorities of economics versus sort of cultural issues or identity politics. And Michael's saying, do you think the cost of Northern Ireland exiting the EU outweigh the traditional divides in the minds of the UK government, and are we likely to see a Northern Ireland hangover when the reality of Brexit hits home? So again, I suppose it's the idea of economics versus, you know, cultural politics. Which is more important or takes precedence? I mean, Michael, in terms of the internal UK, is it all about economics, or is it identity politics at the moment?
Brexit is fundamentally about identity politics and a particular conception about the nation and the state and the relationship between them, driven, as I said, not so much by British identity, but by English identity expressing itself through Britishness. There are multiple strands in British unionism. I say British as opposed to Irish unionism. One of them, which is almost disappearing, has an acceptance that this is a plural union and that devolution is a legitimate expression of variation within a union. Another one is centralist, centralizing kind of Jacobin unionism. That we saw under Margaret Thatcher, we've seen it again more recently. But the overwhelming strand is that we care about Scotland, we don't really care about Northern Ireland. And that pretty much corresponds to attitudes in public opinion, that Northern Ireland is not seen as an indispensable part of the state in the way that Scotland is. But increasingly amongst public opinion, Scotland is also seen as dispensable, and who knows Wales next. So the notion of UK unionism has always been polyvalent. It's always been different in Ireland, different in Scotland, different in Wales. But that difference is becoming ever more evident. And the difficulty for the present government, present Conservative Party, is that they've discovered the union. They've discovered that the union is in crisis. But they don't actually know what the union is. They don't know what it is that they're defending. Hence this muddling through and rather arbitrary picking on some issues rather than others, suddenly discovering their inner Irish unionism, so the protocol is somehow a problem, doing things in Scotland that they think are going to get them votes, but just illustrates their misunderstanding of the way Scotland work. So fundamentally, there is a problem at the centre here, a lack of understanding of the complex nature of the state. So we could muddle our way through disintegration of the United Kingdom, were it not for the fact that pulling the United Kingdom apart is even more complicated than keeping it together.
Okay, folks, we're coming near the end of it. I was going to sort of say half jokingly, so where will we be in 2 years' time? You know, will it all work out as, you know, our mothers and fathers used to say, you'll be grand, it'll be fine, it'll all work out. One imagines that it won't, and it won't work out in a very easy kind of way. Look, I found the 3 papers fascinating because we were focusing on the UK, focusing on Northern Ireland and the kind of different responses to the crisis of Brexit. And yet, with different responses, we can see similarities or common grounds that perhaps is something to sort of think about in the future. I mean, Michael, you constantly talked about the periphery, and certainly in Ireland, the EU has been a way for the periphery, us on the kind of edge of Europe, as it were, to have a voice and to kind of reimagine ourselves in a kind of positive light. And perhaps that's something that the UK needs to sort of think about as well, as that kind of tension between the centre and the periphery. So listen, on behalf of everybody here, and we've had up to 130 people here since 2 o'clock, I'd just like to sort of thank Aaron and Michael and Katie for 3 really great papers that sets up the tone and the scope of this gathering this afternoon and tomorrow. And so if we can all, either in the real world or virtually with our Zoom, sort of put our hands together for our speakers. And just to sort of ask Federico, what time is the next session on it?
Thanks, Derek. So we will take a virtual 30-minute coffee break, and we will be reconvening at 4 p.m. Dublin time sharp. I'm just always saying Dublin time because there's people connecting from across Europe and the United States as well. So we will be back in 30 minutes. But let me just echo Derek's remark and thank the 3 first presenters. It was a great panel. And thank you, Derek, for running the show so perfectly as well. So we will go all dark and suspend the registration, but see you on this call. So don't leave this Zoom in 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Katie.